During the 90s, the domain of the first-person shooter was the domain of the first-person shooter was the home PC. id Software's Doom is considered the genre's breakout title into the mainstream, and largely defined the keyboard and mouse control system that would stay with the genre until this day. Their follow-up to Doom 2, Quake, would add to this with full real-time 3D rendering and 3-axis movement that gave the genre the accurate and immersive control system it needed. Throughout this decade, the genre slowly expanded onto home consoles, and this brought not only obvious performance deficits, but control ones too. Digital controllers were an ill fit for the 3D movement needed in a first-person shooter, and many console manufacturers developed solutions to try and aid in this transition. Step forward Sony's PlayStation Mouse. Welcome to the Gamer's Garden, and in this video we're looking at first-person shooters on the PS1 that support the mouse and seeing how well they do at recreating the feel of the PC control scheme. For some context, let's first look at Sony's direct competition at the time. Sega released the 3D control pad for the Saturn with Nights into Dreams in mid-96, and the exceptional American developer Lobotomy Software included support for the controller in Duke Nukem 3D and Quake. Duke Nukem 3D was first, and it's a very strong port of the game that is greatly improved by using the 3D pad. You even have analog strafing due to the analog triggers the 3D pad has as its shoulder buttons. The standard control scheme maps walking and turning to the analog thumbstick, but with a cheat code you can unlock the Jevons control scheme, which maps looking in all directions to the thumbstick and all movements to the face buttons. It works very well, even though it's the opposite way around to what we're used to in a modern FPS. This control scheme was also in the infamous Saturn port of Quake, again making that game play much better, even with its notorious frame rate. This is still an unbelievable game to be running on the Saturn. There may only be 2 FPSs with analog controls on the Saturn, but they're both very good for it. A mouse did come out for the Saturn, but only one FPS, Doom, made use of it, and it's a horrendous port of the game, so we're not counting it here. Nintendo of course had analog control as standard on the N64, so it is baked into almost every game on the system. The console was home to many FPS games, and the first one to really put it on the map for this was Turok Dinosaur Hunter. It has a control scheme that actually put a lot of people off at first, and it's basically the same as Lobotomy's hidden Jevons control scheme on the Saturn. Looking is mapped to the analog stick and movement mapped to the C buttons. It provides an immersive way to play the game, but really hampers the platforming sections. This was in contrast to GoldenEye's simpler controls, where walking and turning are both mapped to the stick, with the C buttons being used for strafing and looking up and down if you need to. It makes GoldenEye far easier to play, although it's fair to point out that there is far less verticality in the gameplay because of this when compared to the Turok games. So that's what the PlayStation's main competitors had. Solid first-person shooter analog control systems that were a viable, if not perfect, substitute for traditional keyboard and mouse controls. The PlayStation would get its own analog controller as well, and many FPS games would make use of the now standard dual stick system later in the console's life. But a small handful of FPS games went further than that on the console, and that brings us to the PlayStation Mouse, launching with the Japanese release of the console in 1994. This standard 2-button rollable mouse was mainly used with point-and-click adventures and strategy games, but there are in fact 3 FPS games that support the mouse, and we'll have a closer look at each of them. First up, in October 1996, id Software published Final Doom, developed by a keen group of modders of the original. This compilation of sorts runs pretty smoothly, certainly far better than the horrendous Doom port on the Saturn, although the frame rate dips pretty heavily in wider spaces. The controls are pretty good on a standard PlayStation pad, with a setup like the SNES Doom port. The default mapping is fine, with the directions moving you forwards, backwards and turning, while the shoulder buttons strafe, and it works pretty well considering it's all digital. Fine adjustment to your aim is tricky but doable, and I'm sure you could play through the whole game like this. To get Final Doom working with the mouse, you need to plug in both the mouse and a controller. All 3 of the games we're looking at follow this setup, and half of the controller acts as your keyboard inputs. Now immediately this raises an issue with controller binding in this game. You can only map certain things to certain buttons, and unless I miss something obvious, there's no way of mapping strafing to the left and right directions. The best I could do was mapping them to L1 and L2. Not optimal, and the mouse will slowly walk you forward and backward as well with the slightest movement in those directions. The mouse could have worked great with Final Doom if only the developers gave you more freedom to customize the controls. As it stands, I'm not sure the overall effect actually improves the gameplay, so using a mouse with Final Doom actually proves more of a frustrating experience than anything else. A missed opportunity. Next up we have another id Software port with Quake II in September 1999, developed by Hammerhead. This is a brilliant and ambitious adaptation of the game that combines elements of the original and its expansion packs, built from the ground up for the PS1 to ensure it plays as well as it can. Quake II takes advantage of the DualShock's analog controls, but there are no binding options or sensitivity controls. It has the GoldenEye setup, which just doesn't feel good across two sticks, and jump is also mapped to R2 while shooting is R1, so again it's an awkward placement that feels completely unnatural coming from modern games. Adding a mouse greatly improves the control in Quake II, and it allows you to really engage with verticality in the game's design, and while there's very little in terms of adjustment, the default bindings work pretty well and really bring this port of the game to life. L1 and L2 cycle weapons, the D-pad takes care of walking and strafing, and the look controls are mapped to the mouse. If you increase the sensitivity a bit, you are sorted, and can fool yourself into thinking you're playing on a low-end PC from back in the day. The levels in this port are broken up into smaller chunks to keep the game running smoothly within the console's memory limitations, and it works very well at quite a high resolution for the PS1. Although it looks rather blocky, the animation, frame rate, textures and lighting are all fantastic, and it even has a solid 4-player split screen mode. And if you're lucky enough to own 4 PlayStation mice, 4 controllers and 2 multi-taps, that's right, you can do 4-player split screen with everyone having mouse controls. That is a mad and incredibly niche setup that I would love to try someday. Overall, Quake II is a brilliant game on PS1. It's a fantastic port that takes advantage of the target hardware to deliver a technically accomplished game, and a brilliant example of how the PlayStation mouse could enhance the control in a genre that struggles with poor controls on this console. The last of our mouse-compatible FPS games is Alien Resurrection from October 2000, the game of the film developed by Argonaut Software, famous for the Super FX chip on the SNES. Alien Resurrection was actually an early pioneer of modern console FPS bindings, with the left stick controlling walking and strafing, and the right stick turning and looking up and down. Although going on to be the control standard for the genre, many critics were not so appreciative at the time. Whilst rather jerky and again not offering much customization, this standard control setup does work well, and it's the best of the 3 games we're covering in this video. Plug a PlayStation mouse in though, and like Quake II, things get even better. The default bindings are excellent, and the mouse control perfectly complements the weighty and sway-heavy movement in the game. Little touches like the heartbeat in the DualShock near the start still work, and it makes for an extremely immersive experience for a PS1 game. Alien Resurrection is a technically awkward game in some ways, simply too dark in many areas, with an extremely limited field of view and draw distance. But the authentic aesthetic lifts this with very faithful visuals and sound design that are a perfect fit for the film. Scripted events happen often to again increase that sense of immersion and tension, and in many ways this game is an incredible accomplishment for a PS1 game, feeling like a true Alien game, and much like Alien Isolation would do many years later. Using the PlayStation mouse feels like the true way to experience this game, and it really lifts the whole thing. So there we are, the 3 first-person shooters that use the mouse on Sony's PlayStation 1. There's not really enough games for this to be considered the strength of the system. It's a shame that Medal of Honor and Rainbow Six Rogue Spear didn't support the mouse, for instance. But in Quake II and Alien Resurrection, developers proved the experiment could work, that you could bring mouse controls to a home console FPS game successfully, and in a way that enhances the overall game. I will continue this investigation in a future video, looking at another console infamous for its innovation. Thank you for watching, please subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and until the next time, happy gaming.